I also wanted to thank Dr. Linda O'Neill, who helped me a lot with some of the slides that I couldn't figure out. What I'd like to do is ask the question and then try to at least give some answers to whether changes are needed in infants and toddlers' diets. And so to do this, we'll have to start by focusing on what current intakes of older infants and toddlers are. And to do this, we're going to be talking about 3 different countries, USA, China, and Mexico, as examples. Then talk a little bit about how intakes compare to recommendations, and then the recommendations of the specific countries, and then what needs to change if things do need to change, and how we get there. Now, the 3 studies I'm going to be talking about are on this slide, and they are, first of all, the FITS, which is well known to this audience, down at the bottom, the Feeding Infants and Toddlers study here in this country, and the Mexican Nutrition Survey, the ENSANUT, which are both representative samples where you can do usual intakes. And then the third is a study in China, which was primarily of urban Chinese, and they only have 1 day of intake, so you can't do all of the usual intake modeling. But the 3 studies are all of infants over the age of 6 months and toddlers, and then in some studies they went into preschool as well. So this is dietary data that we're going to be talking about. Now, all 3 of those studies show some major concerns with infant and toddler diets. First of all, the fruit and vegetable problem. Secondly, desserts, sweets, and sweetened beverages, particularly in Mexico and the U.S. The whole issue of dietary patterns developing early and then being sometimes conserved into later childhood and perhaps even adulthood. And then the whole issue of dietary diversity. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then some specific nutrient gaps and excessives that are pervasive in some cases, in others limited to a specific country. And then particularly I think in the U.S. and perhaps in Mexico, and particularly with the toddlers, we've got what looks like a problem of energy excesses. There's a lack of, there's the first thing, just looking across all 3 of the, just press, I think that's it's an advertising thing that somebody calls me on every now and then. If we look, first of all, at all 3 countries, and to organize these slides, they'll all be pretty much the same. The USA is over on your left, then China, then Mexico. The yellow is 6 to 11-month-old infants, and then we have 12 to 23-year-old toddlers, so later infancy toddlers, and then 24 to 47 is the gray. So if you go across the slide, you'll see the 3 countries. And what you see there is in the U.S., the percent of children consuming any vegetable, any discrete vegetable, is about 70. But if you go down to Mexico, about 70 to 80% of Mexican children aren't consuming any vegetable on a given day, versus about 20 to 30% among the Chinese or American kids. So that's the story there. The reason for concern. If we look at lack of fruit and vegetable fruit consumption, that again is a key concern in all 3 of the countries. And what you see here is about 70% up to about 80 over that period in the U.S. of percent of children consuming any discrete vegetable fruit on any given day, down to about 50 to 60 percent among the Chinese, and then in Mexico, lower, 50 down to about 45 in the preschool years. So you see in both of those slides some problems that are fairly pervasive. Now, when we go on and start looking at this starts at 0, but we're really interested in 6 months and over. So go in 3 on your on the slide, the third column, up to the end, which is 48 months. And you look at the green, the light green, that's vegetables. If you look at that, you can see that vegetable intake starts low, the little green, light green, and it remains pretty low as well. This is a U.S. slide from FITS. And you can also see by looking at those columns that there's a good deal of consistency, particularly by the toddler years, in terms of dietary patterns. They seem to go out, not perfectly, but pretty much from those early months. Now in Mexico, if you look at the green again, it's a brighter color green in this slide. You see that the consumption is very low, but they've got a bigger problem, I think, in Mexico, and that is the whole issue of very high sugar intakes, particularly after about a year of age, and that too seems to persist up at least until the end of the preschool period. So foods high in sugar make up about 25% of total calories by 12 months, and the vegetables are quite low. So again, some worrying patterns, and the paper on this is Denise Denning's paper in BMC Nutrition. Now let's go across the globe to China and take a look at the Chinese. Now the Chinese do much better in terms of the sweets and desserts. You see those are the little tan color. But the dietary patterns, again, starting at about 6 months, seem to be fairly well established as you go out across the columns. But vegetables are really quite low. So they're doing better on the sweets, but the vegetables aren't really, the vegetables in green are not doing much better. So again, the dietary patterns seem to be established early on. Let's go back to the U.S. and to FITS for a minute and take a look at the top 10 foods in FITS. And this graph, if you can't see it exactly, the 6 to 11 months old are over on your far left, then the toddlers, 12 to 24 months, and then the preschoolers on your far right. And what you see here again is that these top 10 foods, if you just take 10 foods, they make up about 78% in the later infancy, up to about 60% in the toddlers, and then about 60% again in preschool. And again, there's the grain choices, which are in the tan sort of slide color, and milk and dairy are very common. And they go across, again, the ages, starting certainly by toddlerhood. Looking again at another representative survey of the whole population in Mexico, what we see here again, these are the top 10 foods again, going across from later infancy to toddlers to the preschoolers. Pretty much a similar pattern with those foods are the top sources of energy, contributing about 77% to total intake among infants and down to about 57% among toddlers and preschoolers. And these foods make up the top 10 because many, many children consume them, and they contain energy-dense ingredients, so obviously they would contribute a lot to calories. And again, what we see is that the foods are different, and the soups and the stews and the broths in Mexico, and tortillas, of course, as well as sweets and eggs, emerge as major things that are fed to the babies and young preschoolers in Mexico. Now, if we take a look at China, again, looking in China the same way, these foods are the top sources of energy, and they contribute about 86% to total intakes among infants and about 75% among toddlers and preschoolers. And grains that are shown in tan, and rice and noodles along with infant cereal and pancakes, and I think there's sesame pancakes, and breads are all popular at all ages. But eggs and pork are also fed starting very early and continue in toddlerhood and into preschool ages. So it's a very different pattern, or very different foods, even though the patterns seem to be fairly steady. Okay, now this one is one that's, I think, awfully sad to look at from the standpoint of North America, because the Mexicans and the Americans seem to have an awful lot of grams per day of desserts, sweets, and sugar-sweetened beverages. If you look at this slide, which is just grams per day for the blue, which is the infants, or the orange, which is the toddlers, you see that the U.S. is doing not so well, but the Mexicans, particularly the toddlers, are having an awful lot of energy from these sources. Whereas if you look way at the other end of your right, you see that the Chinese are really getting very little, at least in these infants and toddlers. So two problems that we've probably got to do more about than now. And it's possible that since these data were collected, as you know, in Mexico, there have been a lot of efforts to decrease this due to Mexican government efforts. If there are Mexicans in the audience, perhaps you can update us on current consumption, because these data were taken some years ago, I think 2012 or thereabouts. Okay, so that's the problem and some of the things that are good. The next question is, how do intakes compare to current nutrient recommendations? And what we have here is sort of a summary against the dietary reference intakes in Mexico and in the U.S., and Chinese recommendations for China, looking at inadequate intakes and excesses. And this is summarizing a lot of different papers, but basically for infants, certainly iron and vitamin D are problematic in some countries, and added sugar as well. And for the toddlers, the issues vary from one country to the next, but fats, fiber, potassium, vitamins E and D, and calcium, with D and calcium being particular problems in Mexico. And over for toddlers, sodium, saturated fat, added sugar, as we've already mentioned, and also I think energy in the U.S. and in Mexico, but we'll go on to that in a moment. So 65 to 75% of the toddlers in Mexico are consuming more than 10% of calories from sugar, at least at the time the survey was done. Excessive sodium intake over the upper level of 1,500 milligrams among toddlers is shown in this slide. And what it shows, in addition to the fact that China has a big problem with respect to sodium, and U.S. somewhat less, and Mexico the least, the main sources of sodium are quite different. In the U.S. it's meats, in Mexico it's the soups and stews, and in China it's still salt added in home cooking, and of course also soy sauce if the kids are eating anything there. So each country has its own problems. And iron is also a problem, particularly among breastfed infants, and I think you'll see some interesting work in a minute on that. But even though it's higher bioavailability, as you know, the iron in breast milk is relatively low. And the Academy of Pediatrics recommends that from about 4 months on, exclusively breastfed infants should be supplemented with iron. And so from 4 to 6 months, it's expected that the infants will consume about 70% of their energy as milk based on WHO energy requirements. So they'd be expected to obtain about half a milligram of iron per day from breast milk, with the remains having to come from complementary foods. And we'll see in a few minutes more on these issues. So iron's a gap nutrient, particularly among infants, as you see in this slide. This is the percent of children below the recommendations for iron. And what you see here again, for the Mexicans in the middle of the chart, infants 6 to 12 months, many infants having problems, somewhat less, but still a problem in Mexico. In the U.S., somewhat much less. And with toddlers, the Chinese having the most problems, with U.S. next. So again, the patterns vary across the country in terms of both foods and micronutrients. Now, in terms of energy intakes, this is tough because in telephone surveys like FITS, or even in other surveys, it's very difficult to get adequate data on energy because you know it takes a couple of weeks to get really good information. But these are just calculations. The little diamonds are calculations using the Institute of Medicine equations, assuming the low physical activity level, what would be required, the estimated energy requirement, and then mean energy intakes. This is U.S. data. You see that it would be higher, certainly after about in the toddlers and preschoolers, against these estimated requirements. And with Mexico, it's the same story. Mean energy intakes among Mexican infants and children seem to be in excess of estimated energy needs. So we've got problems there that also certainly need to be dealt with. Okay, so are changes needed in dietary patterns of infants and toddlers? I think the answer is yes. Certainly what we do about it is another story. Parents and caretakers certainly have to be good role models themselves, particularly when we're talking about preschoolers as kids go into family meals. But they also have to start early to instill good food habits in healthy child diets, but also in toddlers. And developmentally appropriate foods and patterns are essential as well. And then sustaining these healthy eating patterns in the preschool years and later, of course, is the ultimate goal. Making changes is difficult, but certainly many more in fruits, vegetables and fruits, age-appropriate energy intakes, much less sweets and desserts and sugar-sweetened beverages, an increase in dietary diversity. Since these patterns are established earlier, we don't want kids to just eat one fruit, one vegetable, and never deviate. And then addressing the specific nutrient gaps and excesses that differ. I think I'm amazed at some of the data you'll see later in terms of how they differ in breastfed versus formula-fed and mixed-fed diets. Well, what else? Of course, we need a lot more. As you know, the pyramid starts at 2 years of age. The dietary guidelines used to start at 2. But this year, more and better food-based dietary guidance, I think, will be coming. The U.S. Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee now is addressing, birth to 24. And if you haven't looked at the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition for April, the supplement has those evidence reviews in them. So thank you very much. I'd just like to thank Linda O'Neill particularly, but also all of my co-authors, on this paper from which most of these data came from. Thank you.